Hi there, my friend. I'm Peter Barron. Welcome to today's episode of the Independent School Moonshot Podcast. I am so excited to have Tom Sheppard here. He is the founder of 20 More Students. He's actually a return guest. I love it when folks come back on the pod. I'm always so grateful to folks who agree to do that. And what prompted today's episode was a newsletter that Tom sent. Maybe it was about a month ago or so. And if you're not subscribed to Tom's newsletter, you absolutely should. He's got such great info that he puts out there into the market. And this particular newsletter was about the decline of ninth grade applicants. I was like, oh, this is a really interesting thing to talk about. And I know, it's going to be different in different parts of the country and all the things. There's context for sure, but what an interesting topic for us to dive into. So that's what we're going to talk about today. But before we do that, Tom Sheppard, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Peter, thanks. Nice to be back. Great to be here and great to be launching 20 More Students, where we work with remarkable schools to build enrollment structures that lead them into a very bright future.
I love it. Hey, and tell me a little bit more about yourself and 20 More Students. So if folks are not familiar with you, they can get a little bit more about your background.
Yeah, sure. So as a longtime school person, that's all I've ever done. Teach, be an administrator, be a head of school. But at my heart and soul, as our good friend Leo Marshall reminded me a few weeks ago, I am an enrollment junkie. And that's why I founded 20 More Students, because I love enrollment. I want to help schools and am enjoying every bit of it as I crisscross the country and work with folks in all kinds of different situations to meet their enrollment needs.
And Tom, so I guess in that position, you're getting to see schools in different parts of the country under different, feeling different pressures, whatnot. But in your post, you wrote about how ninth grade applicants at tuition capable families, there's just been a decline. And, that's not new, right? We've seen that in the past, but you're suggesting that it's getting more acute. So I'm curious, what are you seeing now that's different than maybe what we saw 5 or 10 years ago?
Yeah, absolutely. And you said it earlier, you're right. This is by no means a uniform trend, but it is cropping up in markets that you might least expect it, where demographics are surging. It will crop up in markets where you would expect it, where demographics are low. But the bottom line is, I believe that there has been for quite a while a generational shift underfoot. The youngest millennials are now 30 years old, which means they are fully entrenched, with some Gen Zers coming into our parent realm.
Yep.
But as parents of independent schools have become more and more millennials, the fact of the matter is this trend has become more prominent. And the reason for that has all to do with a number of factors. So I believe it's a generational issue.
Yeah. What are some of those factors that you're seeing?
Sure. So for example, their spending priorities for millennials are different. In other words, they're having to work harder and harder to keep up as it is right now. On top of that fact, as Mark Mitchell NS has showed us many times, since 2000, tuition rates have exceeded even the income levels of the top 5% of earners in this country. So it's just harder and harder for families to keep up. So families are making choices early on to prioritize spending in other ways. But here's, I believe, a much more important piece. Independent schools are no longer the center of everybody's family life. I distinctly remember as a child in the 80s at Berkeley Preparatory School, the Parents Association sending out the Parents Association cookbook. I mean, talk about an expression of community that was so real, right? We were all in sports, arts, clubs, community gatherings. That's just not true anymore.
Yeah.
Families are using an a la carte approach to all things in their life, whether it be club sports, whether it be trips, building community elsewhere, such as in churches. It's just not the same as it is. And so as a result, they're less attached to their schools.
There's so many more inputs now, right? Like people are
Yes.
getting hit across all these different things. It's easy to get distracted. Like, so do you think that's part of it?
Yes, I do think it's part of it, but I also think it's a choice.
Mm.
Families do not necessarily want to be all in. The independent school community used to mean you were all in for everything in your life. They want to pick and choose what they want to take out of a school experience. And quite honestly, that's contrary to the independent school model. So, for example, the most obvious case is the rise in club sports. Well, the degree to which families will now choose to attend club sports events instead of schools is well documented and causes, unimaginable frustration on the part of school administrators. Families aren't going back; they're going to do
Yeah.
that. And if they sense this is a point of friction for an independent school, well, they'll just go to a great public school.
I mean, you're talking to a parent of a now freshman in college, and she played 8 years of club soccer. So there were a lot, a lot of, lot of games that we went to over an 8-year time frame. And then my son's a ninth grader and plays club basketball, and I could pretty much every weekend there's 3 games that we're hitting. So yeah, they almost force it into like making it a huge commitment for you, you know?
They do, and to be honest, the costs associated with all that,
Oh yeah.
that's not a negligible piece of a family's financial profile.
100%. Oh, 100%. They're not inexpensive by any stretch. So I'm curious, like we've got these new conditions, right? You've got some generational differences that are happening. One of the things around the generation, I just did this podcast with Megan Gerhart, who's a professor at Miami University and wrote this book called Gentelligence, and talks a
Mm.
lot about generational differences. And what she talks about are like the signals that you get from generations. You can't lump everybody into one big bucket, but certainly there are signals that emerge. And one of the signals being, values and value driven choices. And, which to me suggests that for schools, for a long time, when you log on to, say, an independent school, high school website, you are almost certain to see, student faculty ratio, percentage of faculty with advanced degrees, college acceptance lists, like all these outcome driven things, right? Like the kind of hard stats, but that plays less well with younger generations. They're more values aligned. So in my mind means, schools are probably gonna have to think a little bit differently about how they position themselves in markets. But all that said, it feels like we're still kind of working on enrollment assumptions from even 5 years ago. And, I know you spoke about and you wrote about how like you just can't do that anymore, right? You've got to modernize those assumptions. So talk a little bit more about that.
Sure. The way things happen in schools, it's not a sudden shift like we fall off a cliff.
Right.
It's the stretching of the rubber band, and it can last for decades, but it just stretches and stretches farther and farther. And what we're trying to do in many cases is to achieve the same result, the same enrollment models based on outdated assumptions that have been stretched to their limit. We're accepting fewer full pay applicants into ninth grade. We're accepting fewer qualified applicants in the ninth grade. We're stretching the definition of mission appropriate to meet the same goals. And the problem, of course, in many schools is that we are place based. We have physical structures designed to accommodate a certain model. We lack flexibility, and that's hard. The other piece of it is that to change things requires tough choices. And schools have feelings, as a former head of school said to me once. They're not like for-profit businesses necessarily. And so making those tough decisions can really plague boards and administrative leadership teams.
Yeah, I've seen that as well. It is hard to, there's just so much emotional investment in an independent school, right? And detaching that from, okay, well, we have to think about long-term sustainability. It's easy to say, like it comes out of my mouth pretty easily, but it's much harder, much harder to do.
Yeah. And I'm a big advocate, and I know it's a tough pill to swallow sometimes, but that that focus on long-term sustainability and a prioritization of strategic enrollment management in decisions across the school community is really the path to the future. And it's going to be difficult, but it has to happen if we're going to break through to a new reality.
Well, and I think you framed it as like an enrollment first mindset. Talk about that. Like, what does that mean in your mind?
Yeah, well, sometimes when people hear me say enrollment first mindset, and I get it, they think I'm talking about diminishing the value of the educational program. I get it, because as educators, we want to think first and foremost about pedagogy. We want to think about the purity of education. And I'm not meaning to threaten the supremacy of the educational program. What I am suggesting is that schools have to consider enrollment as a much higher prioritization in all of their decision making. For
Yeah.
example, I'm working with some great directors of teaching and learning right now, And I call them the modern directors of teaching and learning who get this. When I talk to them about programs they can develop, they're not talking about programs they can develop in a vacuum because they think it'd be great for kids. They're thinking about it as great for kids, but also making economic sense in terms of driving revenue. And when they cross that divide and link the two parts of the school, that's when educators and enrollment and finance people can really find common ground because we're working toward a common objective. Basically, our decision-making process is often very siloed or at least disconnected.
How can you help folks get across that divide? Like what are some things that schools can think about?
Well, it's got to start with the head of school, right? And that's perhaps an obvious point of view, but it's also got to just be a real reality check. And we look in the mirror and say, all right, we want our school to be thriving 25 years from now. Now, what are the things we're going to have to do to get there? And it doesn't mean throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but it does mean having conversations differently. It does mean thinking about things in a way that perhaps we would change our very definition of school.
Mm,
That's another hard piece of this. We've come to believe school is a certain thing, but school has to evolve because school evolves as families evolve, as markets evolve, as the world evolves. And I believe the pace of change in schools has to pick up with the pace of change in society.
so what are some ways in which schools may evolve
So,
or
for
need to
example,
evolve? Yeah.
yeah, I'm working with a couple of schools right now and talking to them about as they look to the future and the development of their programming, right? Let's continue to focus on the notion of developing signature programs that are market unique, that are compelling, and most importantly, are right for kids.
Mm,
Because in those signature programs, families are going to be able to see the single most important thing that they want to see today, and that is a return on their investment dollars. Through this program, my child will achieve X outcome that will move them forward.
right.
That sounds terribly transactional. I get that. But unfortunately, that's the world in which we live today. And if we deny it, I think we're going backwards and hurting ourselves.
See, it doesn't feel to me like I know NAS has done really important work around jobs to be done. I mean, that feels like you're building on that.
I would hope so, but I can see
Yeah.
why others might see it differently.
Yeah. Well, what happens if you don't do that? It feels, I think I just put something out there on LinkedIn around some Cato Institute research, and what is it? 40% of independent schools are reporting growth, 32% are in decline, and then who knows what's happening in the middle. I mean, so if we're saying a third of our market is declining, like what choices do we have?
Yeah. We can't keep doing the same old thing.
Yeah.
And that's my fear. But part of it is also the decision making culture in schools, longevity on boards,
Mm.
the confidence that heads have to make tough decisions. Heads of schools now, let's call it what it is. They're in the toughest position I've ever heard before. As I talk to school heads out there, pre-pandemic and post-pandemic, even ones who are highly successful head of schools, they're just burnt out. They're beat down. They're really struggling. And that's not good for the school industry. So we've somehow got to support our leadership and promote longevity and have continuity between boards, heads, and the larger community.
So what are some ways that we can do that? I'm 100% with you. I mean, I've like you have just talked to countless heads, and you can just see the stress. I mean, it's a very complex job with it's thankless in many ways, right?
Yeah,
You're never going to make everybody happy, which is a really difficult position to be in, and it's hard emotionally to reconcile that. So, like, what are some concrete, like, what if in perfect world, like, what are some things that you would do?
sure. Well, I've always been a real advocate of helping our families see what's coming down the line, look
Yeah.
into the future, have something that they can hang their hat on and say, okay, these are things the school is doing transparently. They're doing in a way that builds trust, and they're doing in a way that adds value to my investment. Wow. Do we have to talk about schools in that regard? Yes, we do. I believe we absolutely have to. But more importantly than that, we've got to take a long term view. We've got to avoid reactionary thinking when perhaps there's a downturn. Over time, steady leadership will make a big difference. Most talented head of school I ever worked for 33 years, Joe Wonke was the head of school. Most famous and simple saying he ever came up with was, Tom, I just break the yard up in inches And hopefully, when I look back on my journey, I've made a difference. And over 33 years, he transformed that school in remarkable ways. That's steady leadership.
Yeah. Coming back to the ninth grade, just the declines that you were talking about in your piece, what are some things? I mean, we talked about signature programs. We know about kind of long-term market outlook. But where does the financial aid play into all of this in
Mm,
terms of, making sure that you're providing the right level of access? But there's also on the other side of it's like, okay, well, how are we going to be able to underwrite this long term?
yeah. And this is the quandary for all schools.
Yeah.
And I've come down to my take on this is I think every school has to do what it believes is right for its institutional sustainability. Now, the more we can promote access and affordability, that's great. I'm all in favor of it. But as long as we are not supporting spending financial aid dollars in a way that is just unsustainable. Now, the way to offset that sometimes, because in many schools, if they're seeing a decline in ninth grade applicants, they
Mm,
might also be seeing a surge in early childhood applicants.
interesting.
You know? And that's where you're really going to get your families who can afford school long term. Now, will they all stay through high school? That's a whole nother story.
Yeah.
But if you can build out structures like I built before the school has had that, we built an infant to 2-year-old program. If you can increase capacity in the lower schools, then you're building a grow from below strategy, we call it. And you are then better able to support the applicants in ninth grade who may not be able to afford the full tuition.
Yeah. You know what that says to me, and this is something that I see with in the conversations that I have with heads, is that there's almost this new prerequisite skill that you have to develop and cultivate is to be entrepreneurial.
Mm,
But because
yes.
the playbook that we've been running for independent schools for years just doesn't work as well as it used to, right? The functional gap that we have between what it costs to run the school and what we take in through tuition revenues, according to data, is widening with each year, right? So how are we going to close that gap? Well, to be able to do that, you need, I would imagine, like being creative and entrepreneurial and actually very disciplined about the choices you make is going to be, if it's not already, incredibly important now, it's certainly going to rise in importance over the next few years. I mean, how do you react to that?
I think you and I are on the same page there. I think we both agree that the independent school financial model is on very shaky ground and has been for a couple of decades. That's not going to get any easier. So being entrepreneurial means discovering new ways of thinking, new ways of doing, new ways of engaging, new ways of building community that perhaps didn't fit our definition of school before. And I think those are very context specific.
Yeah.
No two things are going to be right for every school, but if we dig hard enough, we can find the things that fit for each individual school.
Where do you think people should be building that entrepreneurial muscle? Like, what should they be leaning into? Are there, I mean, think back over your career. Like, were there particular books that were very influential? Are there podcasts that you're listening to? Like, what are some ways that, in the absence of not being able to go to an MBA program, like how
Yeah.
can folks start to cultivate those skills?
Yeah, I don't mind saying it. I really Ian Simmons writes some things that are pretty short and pithy, but impactful for me.
Yeah, for sure.
I spend a lot of time obviously listening to Tim Fish because I think he's got some really innovative thoughts about new excellence in the way schools ought to do things.
Both guests on the pod. So yeah, great recommendations.
Right, and I just think that at the end of the day, sometimes we've got to find leaders from outside the school industry to bring in some of that thinking for us.
Yeah. Is there anyone in particular that you're like, "Ah, I love whatever that person is saying?" I can tell you for me, like there are certain pods that I have like I look forward to every week. One of them in particular, I think I've probably said this like 15 times on it, is How I Built This.
Mhm.
It's every week there's a profile of somebody who's done something really interesting entrepreneurial in order to grow their organizations. And not is it always relevant to our work? No, but is there always, like, a little nugget that I take away that I'm like, "Okay, I gotta try that." Uh, Absolutely, and so I'm constantly looking for those examples. I mean, another one, we just did a book club inside a Moonshot Lab on, unreasonable hospitality.
Yeah.
Like, to me, that's gotta be a must read for every independent school leader out there, and people, if you've read it and you're like, Peter, they talk about like, how do you make 11 Madison Park into the world's best restaurant? Like, what does that have to do with independent schools? And I think it has everything to do with independent schools, because that book is all about how do you create those wow magical moments to just delight and surprise your customers. I'm like, that's kind of what we do, right? Like that phone call you get from a faculty member, unannounced, to say, hey, your child is just did this amazing thing. Like, we are so well positioned to do those sorts of things.
And it often requires a willingness to commit to doing some things and letting other things go.
100%.
If
Absolutely.
that's the biggest struggle in schools, to be
Yeah.
candid, because the personnel challenges come with that, the space optimization challenges, but we've got to be willing to do it. Otherwise, we're going to be stuck in the same grind every day.
I mean, this is the work that I do with independent schools with the operating system piece, which is like, all right, you've got to look, you've got strategy, you've got to figure out how you're going to build that into your annual priorities, and like, how are we going to get to that over the course of the year and all that sort of stuff. But what that does is that if you're disciplined about it, you have to make choices. You can't be all things to all people. And even better is that if you take a step back and say, we're making these choices, we're going to do these things, but we also intentionally have to decide what we're not going to do anymore.
Right.
Because like, we are so good at adding things, we are really bad at taking things away. Like, super
Amen.
bad. And in fact, oh, go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah.
No, you're so right, and I understand why that is, because again, many of our schools are built on generations of alumni. They're built
Sure.
on a community of parents with different perspectives, and the turbulence it can cause is significant. I get that,
Yeah.
so we've got to find a way to manage that, but we do have to make the tough choices.
Well, let's bring it back to the enrollment first culture. So imagine, a head of school called you and said, hey, Tom, I listened to this pod. A lot of what you talked about are things that we're wrestling with right now. I want to create an enrollment first culture. Uh, how do I do that? Like, what advice would you offer that head on a phone call?
Yeah. I think it all starts with the board and the head, and all starts with the leadership team gently coming to understand each other's perspectives. So, for example, I'm working with the school right now. I'm going to do a workshop with them tomorrow. I'm working with them all year. And this is exactly what we're doing. We're
Mm,
reaching the point where we are imagining a future in which choices have to be made differently,
mm,
perhaps to elevate a certain program. But we're running through a series of exercises to understand what are the trade offs, what are the challenges, and if we do this, is it going to grow enrollment? And if the answer is yes, then it should probably be a priority. So I think it's got to start with a lot of reflection, a lot of soul searching, but also a common ground and realizing that it just can't continue to be the way it was before. Once we do that, once we have a common perspective, we can start to gently develop programs that achieve this and show families the return on their investment, the value of what they're doing, and leave them feeling that their kids' education is worth every penny they're spending on it. Because if we don't, the option of free magnet programs is pretty darn appealing.
yeah. It's so interesting that you used the term investment. I had given a talk maybe a year or so ago, and I've got this talk that I do around, what I've learned from heads of school and
Yeah.
whatnot. And I have these slides where I kind of position, it's just for fun, but like, I say, hey, like, would you invest in my business? And I've got a slide showing like how I'd make money. And it's kind of absurd, but it is what it is. And then the next slide is like, hey, this is actually how we make money in independent schools. Right. And so it's like this contrast of, this doesn't feel like a great investment personally, but yet we're asking families to invest in this as well. And somebody stood up and said, hey, like, I appreciate the exercise, but I don't think families are like, parents aren't making investments in our schools. And I did not answer it well. I was like, ugh. And it was funny 'cause I just had surgery on my ankle. I was like up in front of the stage with my foot propped on the scooter. Like, it was so crazy. And my wife had to drive me down because it was local, and I was driving down. And as we were driving back, I looked at her. I was like, I have the answer. I was like, because it was such a good question. I didn't have a great answer for it, but I think you just nailed it, which is, Absolutely, families are making a financial investment
Sure
in
they
our
are.
schools. They have very clear outcomes that they're looking for their children. It may not be like they may not be saying, "Hey, I'm going to invest in the stock market and expect a 10% return on that stock investment," but they are investing in their child's future because they want their child to be able to unlock incredible opportunities down the line.
Good.
So, I really do appreciate how you use that language because you're way more advanced in talking about it than I was then. That's for sure.
Yeah. And it's just true. I hate to say it, but I think families want to feel like they're walking into Tiffany's and buying a Tiffany's, a bracelet. The school experience needs to be like that, as
Yeah.
crass as that may sound.
Yeah.
But that's the kind of marketing, communication, and programming we've got to deliver. Otherwise, they're gone.
Yeah, and why I always recommend reading Unreasonable Hospitality, because I think it really does help you think through, like, how can you deliver on an experience in that way? Tom Sheppard, a founder of 20 More Students, this has been fantastic. If somebody wants to follow up and reach out, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, just 20morestudents.com. Website's up there, email, contact information. Always look forward to continuing the conversation, helping schools in any way we can.
Awesome, Tom. You're the best. Really do appreciate it.
Thanks, Peter.
And for those of you who are members of Moonshot Lab, hang tight. We're going to continue with the extended version of the interview. But again, Tom Sheppard, thank you so much.
All right.